There's a claim making the rounds this week that deserves a careful, unhurried look because it is being repeated far more often than it is being explained. The claim comes from Melik Kalin, a veteran geostrategy writer for Forbes, who has covered conflicts on the ground for 3 decades, from the Caucasus to Central Asia to the war in Ukraine itself. In a column published at the end of June, Kalin argued that Vladimir Putin is, in his words, in terminal trouble, and that if the pressures now bearing down on Russia continue or intensify, the Russian leader could be removed from power within the next 3 years. That is a striking prediction from a serious commentator, not a fringe blogger, and it deserves to be treated with the same mixture of interest and skepticism we would give any confident forecast about the innermost workings of a closed authoritarian system. So let's walk through what Kalin is actually saying, what evidence he and others are pointing to, what the counter-arguments look like, and where the honest uncertainty in all of this really sits. Start with the shape of the argument itself. Kalin is not saying Putin will definitely fall. He is laying out a set of scenarios, ranked loosely by plausibility, for how a Russian leader in Putin's position might lose power if current trends persist. At one end of the spectrum is a fast, violent removal, an assassination or a coup carried out quickly before Putin's loyalists have time to organize a defense. At the other end is something slower and more theatrical, a process in which the people around Putin engineer his downfall in a way that lets them survive politically while he takes the blame. Kalin draws an explicit historical comparison here to Romania in 1989. Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian communist dictator, was seized by his own military as the regime collapsed around him, given a hurried trial, and executed within days, while much of the old political and economic elite quietly continued running the country under a new, nominally democratic label. The lesson Kalin draws from that episode is that a dictator's inner circle does not need to believe in democracy or reform to turn on him. It only needs to conclude that he has become a liability and that sacrificing him is the cheapest way to protect themselves and preserve the system that keeps them wealthy and powerful. If that logic ever takes hold in Moscow, Kalin suggests, Putin himself could become the scapegoat for the war's failures, tried and discredited while the broader elite structure survives intact. Kalin's reasoning rests on a few pillars, and it is worth taking each one seriously rather than treating the whole argument as a single, undifferentiated vibe. The first pillar is history. He points out that Russia, in its various incarnations, has undergone genuine regime change twice in the past century, and both times it followed a catastrophic, demoralizing military campaign. The first was the First World War, which ended not just in Russian defeat, but in the collapse of the Tsarist system and the Bolshevik Revolution. The second was the Soviet War in Afghanistan, a grinding, unwinnable conflict that bled prestige and resources out of Moscow for a decade and became one of the accelerants of the Soviet Union's eventual dissolution. Kalin's implicit question is whether the war in Ukraine, now well into its 5th year, is starting to resemble those two precedents rather than a contained, manageable conflict that the Kremlin can absorb indefinitely. The second pillar is the specific, visible strain on occupied Crimea. Ukrainian long-range strikes have been hitting fuel depots, refineries, and logistics nodes deep inside Russia and in occupied territory with increasing frequency and precision. The effect on Crimea has been dramatic. The peninsula's fuel supply has been squeezed hard enough that reports describe civilian fuel sales being suspended in some areas, long lines of vehicles trying to leave during what would normally be peak tourist season, and a Russian occupation administration struggling to keep basic services running. Because Crimea is a peninsula, its physical links to the Russian mainland are limited, and the Kerch Bridge, the showcase engineering project connecting Crimea to Russia proper, has become the last significant conduit for fuel and supplies after repeated Ukrainian strikes degraded other routes. That bridge, already damaged multiple times over the course of the war, is both a literal bottleneck and an enormous symbolic target. If it were ever put out of commission for an extended period, the psychological impact in Russia would likely exceed even the practical one. Reports describe a real exodus of occupation personnel and settlers from Crimea as conditions have deteriorated, which is a strong signal that people closer to the ground assess the situation as more fragile than official Russian statements suggest. The third pillar is the mood among ordinary Russians, and more importantly, among Russia's political and business elites. There is a meaningful difference between public grumbling, which authoritarian systems can usually absorb for years, and elite anxiety, which is far more dangerous to a leader because elites actually control the levers, the money, and the security apparatus. Kalin points to a specific viral episode. A Russian military blogger and war veteran posted a video warning of unrest in the ranks and demanding a personal televised meeting with Putin to relay concerns passed to him by more senior figures. That video reportedly drew more than 10 million views. It was followed first by a softer, walked-back version, and then by a separate video from a group of soldiers threatening to turn on the officers they blame for mistreatment. None of that, on its own, constitutes a mutiny. But the fact that this kind of content can circulate that widely inside Russia's tightly policed information space, and that soldiers feel emboldened enough to publicly threaten their own chain of command, is being read by some analysts as evidence that the usual mechanisms of control are fraying at the edges, even if they have not broken. Layered on top of that is the death of Sergei Ivanov, a longtime Putin ally, former KGB colleague, and for years considered a plausible successor, who died at 73 under circumstances described as mysterious. Kalin's point is not that this proves an assassination or a power struggle. It is that in a system built on patronage and personal loyalty, the sudden removal of a senior, well-connected figure tends to make everyone else around the leader nervous. When potential rivals or heirs start disappearing, whether through natural causes, accident, or something more deliberate, the remaining inner circle tends to recalculate its own risk, and people who feel unsafe sometimes act preemptively rather than wait to find out if they are next. That dynamic, paranoia begetting more paranoia, is one of the classic mechanisms by which authoritarian systems destabilize from within, and it does not require a grand conspiracy to get started. It only requires enough uncertainty at the top. Kalin also spends real time on the architecture of Putin's personal security, because it is central to why a coup, if one ever came, would likely look different in Russia than in a country with a single unified military chain of command. Putin has spent 2 decades deliberately building overlapping, competing security structures rather than one dominant force. The FSB, the domestic successor to the KGB, Interior Ministry troops, the National Guard known as Rosgvardia, with a reported strength in the hundreds of thousands, and tens of thousands of personnel dedicated directly to his own protection. The strategic logic behind this fragmentation is straightforward. No single agency is ever powerful enough on its own to move against him, because each is watched and checked by the others. But that same fragmentation cuts both ways. Each of these forces answers first and foremost to its own commanders, not to some abstract concept of the state, and each represents both a shield for Putin and a potential threat, depending on where its loyalty ultimately lies, if the center ever looks weak. Kalin raises the possibility that if real instability arrived, it might not look like a clean, single coup at all, but something closer to a civil war among competing security factions, each trying to secure its own position as the old order comes apart. There's also a China dimension to Kalin's analysis that is easy to overlook, but genuinely important. Russia's ability to keep fighting in Ukraine and to keep its economy functioning under sanctions depends heavily on continued Chinese economic engagement, including as a market for energy exports and a source of components and trade that route around Western restrictions. Kalin's argument is that Beijing is not a passive bystander. If Chinese leadership ever concluded that a weakened, unstable Putin had become more of a liability than an asset, for instance, by creating chaos on China's northern border, or by becoming too unpredictable a partner, China would have several tools available to accelerate his fall, from quietly reducing support to more aggressive moves. This is speculative, and Kalin treats it as such, but it is a useful reminder that Russia's internal stability is no longer a purely domestic Russian question. It is entangled with the interests of outside powers who have their own reasons to want either a stable, compliant Moscow or, alternatively, a much weaker one. Now, it would be a disservice to just repeat one columnist's argument as though it were settled fact, because it isn't, and Kalin himself is careful to frame this as an assessment of trend lines and triggers, rather than a prophecy. Other analysts who look at the exact same set of facts reach a more cautious conclusion, and their reasoning is worth taking just as seriously. The core counter-argument is this. Being weaker than before is not the same thing as being close to falling. Putin still controls the military high command, the security services, state media, the courts, and the formal levers of the economy. Every plausible opposition figure inside Russia who might have organized or led a genuine political alternative is dead, imprisoned, or in exile, which means that even if elite discontent is real and growing, there is no visible, organized alternative center of power ready to step into a vacuum if one opened up. Historically, authoritarian systems can look badly weakened, corroded, and unpopular for years, sometimes decades, before anything actually breaks, precisely because the people who would need to act against the leader are also the people most invested in the system he presides over, and coordinating a move against him carries enormous personal risk if it fails. That structural inertia should not be underestimated. This is echoed in more sober assessments from research institutions and government-linked analysts who track Russian elite politics closely. Their conclusion, in essence, is that adverse trends are indeed intensifying across the economic, military, and security domains simultaneously, and that discontent among Russia's political and business elite is growing as the balance of costs and benefits of the current arrangement shifts. But they stop well short of calling this an imminent crisis. Their view is that a genuine crisis of power, an actual elite revolt with teeth, becomes significantly more likely only if one or more specific triggers occurs. An outright Russian defeat in the war, a severe and undeniable economic crisis that can no longer be papered over, or Putin himself losing the physical capacity to govern, whether through illness, incapacitation, or death from natural causes. As of now, none of those three triggers looks imminent, even though the underlying pressures feeding into all three are visibly building. That is a more measured framing than Putin's days are numbered. But it is not a dismissal either. It is closer to saying the kindling is accumulating, but there is no fire yet, and it is genuinely uncertain what, if anything, will provide the spark or when. It is worth spending some time on the economic picture specifically, because this is where the evidence is most concrete and least speculative, even if its ultimate political consequences remain uncertain. Russia's federal budget has come under real measurable strain through the first half of 2026. Multiple independent assessments describe a budget deficit in the first half of the year that already exceeds the entire deficit target set for the whole of 2026, driven substantially by a steep drop in oil and gas revenue, which by some estimates fell by roughly a third compared with the prior year. Defense spending has been consuming a growing share of total state expenditure, with some estimates putting it at close to half of all federal outlays in the first quarter alone, and full-year projections running into the tens of billions of dollars beyond what was originally budgeted. To cover the widening gap, Moscow has leaned harder on domestic borrowing, which pushes up interest rates and, over time, squeezes the parts of the economy that are not directly tied to the war effort. Independent economic analysts describe Russia's economy as increasingly two-speed, a defense industrial sector still benefiting from wartime prioritization, running alongside a broader civilian economy that is suffering from high inflation, rising business bankruptcies, tightening credit, and labor shortages caused by both mobilization and emigration. Small and medium-sized businesses in particular report widespread revenue losses, and authorities have responded with unpopular measures, such as raising the value-added tax rate and lowering the threshold at which smaller firms must start paying it. Moves that squeeze exactly the parts of the population and business community that have the least cushion to absorb new costs. And reports of discussions around more drastic steps, including proposals touching household bank deposits, reflect just how constrained the fiscal picture has become, even if such steps have not been formally enacted. The war in Iran complicates this picture in an interesting way, and it is worth untangling because the timeline matters. When that conflict began earlier in 2026, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the disruption of a huge share of global oil and gas shipments sent crude prices sharply higher, at one point pushing Brent well above $100 a barrel and briefly beyond $120. For a Russian budget built on oil exports, plus a windfall from a simultaneous surge in gold prices, that spike was, for a period, an unexpected economic gift, propping up revenues that had been sliding for months and giving the Kremlin more breathing room than its underlying fundamentals justified. But that gift has proven temporary. As diplomatic efforts produced a ceasefire framework between the United States and Iran through the spring and into early summer, and as shipping through the Strait of Hormuz began to normalize, oil prices fell back substantially from their wartime peaks, tumbling roughly a fifth from the highs reached earlier in the year. Gold prices also pulled back from their own highs, erasing a meaningful share of the paper gains Russia had booked. Longer-range forecasts from Russian and international economic institutions alike now point toward oil prices, settling well below the levels the Kremlin had built into its 2026 and 2027 budget assumptions, which means the structural deficit problem that briefly appeared to ease is very likely to reassert itself in the months ahead, just as Ukrainian strikes on refineries and fuel infrastructure continue to bite. In short, the Iran war gave Moscow a temporary reprieve rather than a lasting solution, and that reprieve now looks to be fading precisely as other pressures on the Russian economy remain firmly in place. None of this means economic collapse is around the corner, and it is important to be precise about that, because the record of predictions of imminent Russian economic collapse since 2022 has not been a good one. Russia's central bank retains substantial reserves, gold holdings, and the ability to keep financing the war through domestic debt issuance for a considerable time. Yet, unemployment remains low by conventional measures, in part because the labor market has been distorted by military recruitment and wartime industrial demand, rather than because the broader economy is healthy. Some analysts who study Russian energy exports in detail argue that Moscow could likely sustain the war effort even with a substantial further reduction in oil and gas exports, because the state has shown a consistent willingness to prioritize military spending over civilian welfare and to extract resources from the rest of the economy to keep the war machine funded. The picture that emerges from the most careful analyses is not one of a country on the verge of economic implosion, but of a system slowly consuming its own buffers, running down reserves, deferring maintenance, and postponing reckonings, while betting that either battlefield success, a negotiated settlement, or simple endurance will arrive before those buffers run out entirely. So where does that leave the central question? Is Putin's position actually at serious risk within a 3-year window, as Kalin argues, or is this closer to wishful thinking dressed up in analytical language? The honest answer is that both the case for taking this seriously and the case for skepticism are genuinely strong, and a fair-minded observer should hold them together rather than collapsing into either the regime is about to fall or nothing has really changed. What has changed, verifiably, is the accumulation of simultaneous pressures across multiple domains at once. Military pressure from an increasingly capable Ukrainian long-range strike campaign that is reaching deep into Russian territory and occupied Crimea. Economic pressure from a structurally widening budget deficit that a temporary oil price spike only briefly masked. And social or elite-level pressure visible in things like viral dissent among war veterans. Unusual public displays of unease and the nervous reshuffling that tends to follow the unexplained death of a senior insider. Any one of these pressures in isolation would likely be manageable for a system as entrenched as Putin's. It is the simultaneity, the fact that fiscal strain, battlefield setbacks, and elite anxiety appear to be building at the same time rather than one at a time, that gives arguments like Kalin's more traction than they might otherwise deserve. At the same time, the skeptics have a genuinely strong argument too, and it should not be waved away just because the more dramatic prediction is more attention-grabbing. Authoritarian systems, and Russian authoritarianism in particular, have repeatedly demonstrated a capacity to absorb punishment, adapt, and endure well past the point where outside observers expected them to break. Putin has survived sanctions, battlefield reversals, the Wagner Mutiny of 2023, and years of predictions of his imminent downfall, in part because he has spent 2 decades systematically dismantling any organized alternative to his rule. And in part because the elite around him remains bound together by shared complicity and shared risk in ways that make coordinated defection extremely costly for any individual who might consider it. A system with no viable opposition and a fragmented, mutually suspicious security apparatus is not necessarily a system on the verge of collapse. It can just as easily be a system that is stable precisely because no faction trusts any other faction enough to move first, which is a form of paralysis that favors the status quo even when everyone privately recognizes the status quo is failing. What would actually move this from a slow-burning, ambiguous situation into something closer to Kalin's more dramatic scenarios is reasonably well specified by the more cautious analysts, even if they disagree on the odds. A decisive, undeniable Russian military defeat, something the Kremlin could not spin as a tactical pause or a negotiated pivot, would be the clearest trigger, because it would strip away the narrative of inevitable, grinding progress that has been used to justify years of sacrifice. A severe economic crisis, distinct from the slow motion of fiscal erosion currently underway, meaning something like a currency collapse, a banking crisis, or a sudden sharp drop in living standards that could not be blamed on external actors, would be another. And Putin's own physical incapacitation, whether from illness, accident, or simple mortality given his age, remains the wild card that no amount of institutional analysis can fully account for, because personalist authoritarian systems are, by definition, unusually dependent on the survival and continued competence of one individual. None of these 3 triggers currently looks imminent based on available evidence, but none of them looks impossible either, and the broader trend lines, a costlier war, a strained budget, a fraying information environment, and visible nervousness among people who are usually very good at hiding it, are all moving in a direction that makes each of those triggers somewhat more plausible than they were a year or 2 ago, even if somewhat more plausible is a long way from likely. There is one more piece of this worth naming plainly, because it shapes how outside actors, particularly in Europe, are thinking about all of this, not as passive observers, but as participants with their own interests. From the standpoint of European security policy, the assessment that Russia is not on the brink of collapse, but is under intensifying multi-domain strain, translates into a fairly direct strategic conclusion that weakening Russia's capacity to sustain the war and deepening the internal tensions already visible inside the country serves the concrete goal of reducing Moscow's ability to wage large-scale, multi-domain warfare against both Ukraine and, potentially, NATO members down the line. That is not a prediction about Putin's personal fate. It is a statement about strategic incentives, and it explains why continued tightened sanctions on Russian energy exports, sustained support for Ukraine's long-range strike capability, and pressure on the shadow fleet of tankers that helps Russia evade the existing price cap on its oil are being treated by European and allied policymakers as tools that serve both the immediate war effort and the longer-term goal of constraining what a post-war, or even a during war, Russia is capable of doing next. It is worth dwelling a little longer on the Ceausescu comparison, because Kalin is not the first analyst to reach for it, and he has in fact used a version of this framework before in a different context, which tells us something about how he thinks these transitions tend to unfold in personalist, patronage-based systems more broadly. Years earlier, writing about unrest in Kazakhstan, Kalin noted a recurring pattern across several post-Soviet and adjacent authoritarian states. A moment of acute crisis, sometimes real and sometimes theatrically amplified, that allows an unpopular or endangered leader to be removed or sidelined while the broader elite structure around him survives, largely intact, its wealth and position preserved. He pointed to Nazarbayev's Kazakhstan, to Chavez's brief flight from Venezuela, followed by his triumphant return, and to the Romanian precedent itself, as variations on the same underlying mechanism. In each case, according to this framework, what looks from the outside like dramatic regime change is often something narrower, a controlled release of pressure that removes or repositions a single figure without disturbing the deeper architecture of who actually controls the money and the security services. If that pattern holds for Russia, the most likely outcome, even in a genuine crisis scenario, might not be a wholesale transformation of the Russian state, but something closer to an internal reshuffling in which Putin himself is sacrificed, in one form or another, while the system that produced him persists under new management. That is a meaningfully different, and in some ways less hopeful outcome than the kind of clean or transformative regime change that outside observers sometimes imagine when they hear a phrase like Putin could be overthrown. The Ukrainian side of this equation deserves its own moment of attention, because Kalin's argument is, at bottom, a claim about how Ukraine's military strategy is generating second-order political effects inside Russia. And that strategy has visibly evolved over the past year. Rather than concentrating solely on the front lines in the east and south, Ukrainian forces have built out a long-range strike capability, heavily reliant on domestically produced drones and missiles capable of reaching refineries, fuel depots, rail junctions, and military-industrial sites hundreds or even over 1,000 kilometers inside Russian territory. The strategic logic is straightforward, even if the engineering behind it is not. A modern war machine runs on fuel, and a modern war economy runs on the tax and export revenue that fuel production generates. By repeatedly targeting the infrastructure that turns crude oil into usable diesel and gasoline, Ukraine has been able to impose costs on Russia's ability to supply both its military and its civilian population without needing to seize and hold additional territory to do it. The reported disruptions extend well beyond Crimea. Multiple regions inside Russia proper have experienced fuel rationing and shortages at various points, a symptom that would have been almost unthinkable earlier in the war, when Russian territory outside the immediate front lines felt largely insulated from the conflict's daily costs. That shift, from a war experienced mostly by soldiers in border regions to one whose effects are increasingly visible in fuel lines and price tags far from the fighting, is precisely the kind of change in optics that erodes a regime's sense of control, even when no single strike is individually decisive. There is also a generational and information dimension worth naming, because authoritarian stability depends heavily on the state's ability to control what its population believes about the war's trajectory, and that control has become measurably harder to maintain. The viral spread of dissenting military content, soldiers openly complaining about leadership, veterans demanding direct audiences with Putin, footage of fuel queues and empty shelves circulating despite official messaging, all of this represents a departure from the tightly managed information environment Russia maintained in the war's earlier years. It does not mean Russian state media has lost its grip on the majority of the population, and it would be a mistake to overstate how much genuine political opposition this translates into. Public frustration with wartime hardship, conscription, and economic strain is not the same thing as public appetite for regime change, and years of research on authoritarian resilience suggest that grievance and rebellion are connected by a much longer and more uncertain chain of events than casual observers often assume. But the erosion Kalin describes of the state's ability to fully script the narrative its own citizens and soldiers consume is a real and measurable phenomenon, and it matters because legitimacy in these systems ultimately rests less on genuine popularity than on the perception among elites and security services in particular that the system remains firmly in control of events. Once that perception starts to crack, even modestly, it can change the calculations of exactly the people whose loyalty determines whether a leader survives a crisis or not. Pulling all of this together, the fairest summary is something like this. Melik Kalin's argument that Putin could be overthrown within 3 years if current trends persist is a serious, well-sourced piece of analysis from someone with genuine expertise, not a throwaway prediction, and it correctly identifies real, verifiable pressures. A fuel-starved Crimea increasingly cut off from the mainland, a Russian budget running a deficit far beyond its own targets, even after a temporary boost from the Iran war's oil price spike, visible cracks in elite and military morale, and a security apparatus deliberately built to be fragmented, which makes it more coup-resistant in normal times, but potentially more chaotic if real instability ever does take hold. At the same time, More cautious assessments from institutions that track Russian elite politics closely are correct to note that none of the specific triggers most likely to produce an actual crisis of power, decisive military defeat, a full-blown economic crisis, or Putin's incapacitation currently appears imminent, and that structural erosion is not the same thing as structural collapse. The truth, as is so often the case with predictions about closed authoritarian systems, sits somewhere between the two camps and will likely stay there for some time. What can be said with real confidence is that the pressures on Putin's system are compounding rather than easing, that the war in Ukraine continues to impose costs Russia cannot fully offset, even with favorable external shocks like the temporary Iran-driven oil spike, and that the next real test of the system's resilience will come not from any single dramatic event, but from whether these accumulating strains, military, economic, and psychological, continue to build in parallel long enough and far enough to eventually cross a threshold that none of us can precisely locate in advance. Until then, the honest position is neither confident prediction nor dismissal, but close, sustained attention to exactly the indicators Kalin and the more cautious analysts alike are watching. The state of the Kerch Bridge and Crimea's fuel supply, the trajectory of the federal budget deficit as the Iran war oil price boost fades, the mood inside the military and security services, and above all, whether any of the three real trigger events, defeat, economic crisis, or incapacitation, moves from possible to actual. It is also worth resisting the temptation to treat this as a story with a clean, satisfying ending on a fixed timeline, because that is rarely how the collapse of entrenched authoritarian systems has actually unfolded historically, even in the cases most often cited as precedent. The Soviet Union did not fall in a single dramatic afternoon. It eroded for years through a combination of economic stagnation, an unwinnable war, and a leadership transition that happened to put a reformer in charge at exactly the moment the system's contradictions became unmanageable, and even then, few analysts at the time correctly called either the timing or the mechanism in advance. The Tsarist collapse in 1917 looked, right up until the final weeks, like a system that might yet muddle through a difficult war. And it was only in retrospect that the accumulated strain of military failure, food shortages, and elite alienation became an obviously fatal combination. Applying that lesson here suggests a degree of humility is warranted on all sides of this debate. Kalin's 3-year window is a considered estimate, not a calculation with any real predictive precision, and the analysts urging caution are equally unable to specify with confidence how long a strained but still functioning system can continue absorbing pressure before something gives. What both camps can agree on, and what is probably the most useful thing to take away from all of this, is the list of things actually worth watching, because those indicators will tell us more in real time than any single forecast can. Watch whether Ukraine's long-range strike campaign continues to expand in reach and frequency, and whether Russian air defenses show any sign of degrading their ability to intercept it. Watch the federal budget figures each quarter, particularly the gap between the oil price Moscow's budget assumes and the oil price the market actually delivers, now that the temporary boost from the Iran war is fading. Watch for further unexplained deaths, unusual reshuffles, or purges among senior security and military officials, since those have historically been reliable, if imperfect, signals of rising internal tension. And watch, above all, for any sign that the elite around Putin, rather than the general public, is beginning to hedge its bets, moving assets, distancing itself rhetorically, or quietly building relationships with potential alternative power centers. Because in a system like this one, it is the elite's judgment about which way the wind is blowing, far more than public opinion, that will ultimately decide how this ends and when.